Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Jason Rausch, and I'll be your facilitator today for the webinar. I serve as the Senior Vice President of Instructional Development at Project Lead the Way. As we begin, please introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. Great. Go team. So welcome again. The STEM Ally Series is a collaboration between Project Lead the Way and EdWeek. For those not familiar, Project Lead the Way is a national not-for-profit that believes learning by doing helps prepare students for a STEM-driven world. And through our project-based curriculum, best-in-class professional development, and grants for curriculum adoption, we support teachers in all 50 states to create an environment to make every student in every grade STEM successful. You can learn more about Project Lead the Way at PLTW.org. So a little bit about CEUs. If you're interested in earning CEUs, continuing education units, for attending today's webinar, EdWeek is providing them to all participants. Certificates of completion are available to all registered live attendees who attend 53 minutes or more of this webinar. Your certificate will be emailed to you. EdWeek recommends you verify with your school, district, county, or state that the PD will qualify for your CEUs. Great, I see welcomes coming in the chat. Today, we've invited 3 amazing educators who are focused on empowering students with computational thinking skills. These 3 experts will share strategies and examples of student-centered learning. Before we get started, I'm going to share a few tips on how to maximize your webinar experience. First, join the conversation. Share your expertise, strategies, examples, stories, and experiences, and ask questions by engaging with your fellow participants and presenters. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A tab. If you're having any audio trouble during the webinar, please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker volume. If you are still having issues, please see our detailed audio troubleshooting file available in the resource list under Q&A window. If the console freezes or you hear music after the presentation has begun, please refresh your browser. Read about today's speakers in the speaker bio window and download a copy of today's slides from the resource list. Follow the conversation about today's webinar on X using the hashtag #EWWebinar. An on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the slides will be accessible through edweek.org or using the same login that you used today. So let's jump in. So here's our agenda for today. First, we'll have each presenter introduce themselves and share their definition of computational thinking. Then we'll have 3 sections, including examples from the field, strategies to try out, and guidance for newbies. We also hope to have time for questions at the end. Presenters, thank you so much for being here today. I'd love for you to briefly introduce yourself and share how you define computational thinking. Sharin, we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Sharin Jacobs. I'm a researcher in computational thinking pathways at Digital Promise. I have a strong background in language and literacy. I was a high school English as a second language teacher and got my master's in applied linguistics. And when I entered my first year of the PhD program, I was fortunate to be on the ground floor of a partnership with Santa Ana Unified, which has among the highest percentages of Latina and multilingual students in the nation. And we wanted to solve problems that were important to Santa Ana Unified, and they wanted to increase STEM and literacy learning for their multilingual students. So we developed a computational thinking curriculum that was integrated with literacy to meet the needs of multilingual students. This was a perfect opportunity for me to merge my background in language and literacy with computational thinking. So I'm really excited about presenting today on an integrated computational thinking and literacy toolkit that explores the relationships between computational thinking, language, and literacy. In terms of defining computational thinking, I think it's really important to distinguish between computational thinking, computer science, and coding. So computer science is just a subject like math, science, medicine that involves a study of computers, including their hardware, software, algorithmic processes, and impacts on society. Programming involves reading and writing of programming languages like Java and Python. But computational thinking is an approach to solving problems. And at its essence, it's the ability to formulate thoughts and questions that in a manner that are interpretable by a computer. So there's a saying that the computer is never wrong. It's only the instructions we give a computer that can be wrong. So really being able to instruct a computer to complete a set of tasks. Thank you.
Great. We'll transition to our second presenter, Victor, or should I say Coach Hicks?
Hi, how are you? Well, it depends on who you ask. So my name is Victor Coach Hicks. I am the proud founder and owner of Coding with Culture. We are an organization that looks to build a kindergarten through HBCU, or historically Black college and university pathway, in computational and design thinking. I'm coming to you guys with about this is year 24 in education, year 4 as an edupreneur. And after starting to teach computer science, when I moved to Atlanta, we had an opportunity to start a K-5 computer science program, but realizing how much of an equity issue that computer science was. So as this went on, realizing that coding was only one small piece of the background, or excuse me, one small piece of the puzzle, and realizing that the bigger skill that we wanted students to be able to use and to practice in day-to-day was that computational thinking. So a little bit of our organization, we definitely focus on culturally responsive STEM education. We are very cognizant of the fact that there is not enough diversity in computer science and in engineering as a whole. So we hope to use computational thinking as that equity tool, and through exposing students to historically Black colleges, we hope to give them a very clear pathway to continue to sharpen those skills. Some of our works that we've done, we tend to combine project-based learning. So projects such as designing a Minecraft HBCU, ask students to use, or allow students to use, computational thinking while celebrating their cultural heritage. So we're excited today to share how culturally sustainable approaches to computational thinking empower historically excluded populations in both STEM and design. For us, computational thinking is a way to break down complex problems into smaller and more manageable steps using logic and analysis. This does include computer science, but is not defined by it completely. We hope that as we teach our students computer science, computational thinking, it allows students to go back to their communities and use these real-world project skills, to create solutions for their communities. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Victor. And now we'll turn it over to Katie. Katie, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Katie Marchionna. I'm the Computational Thinking Project Manager in Michigan with Project Tomorrow. Project Tomorrow is a nonprofit organization involved in EdTech. We do a lot of research in data collection, and we're particularly interested in the concerns and the needs of students and teachers and administrators, as well as families and employers and communities. And particularly in learning how those needs and concerns will impact classrooms in the future. We view computational thinking as a set of strategies for solving complex problems. And those problems can be academic problems across all the different content areas, as well as real world and real life problems that students face and need to know how to solve. We focus on 4 key concepts, we call them, or strategies for computational thinking. Those are decomposition, which is taking a complex problem and breaking it down into parts. Algorithm design, which is coming up with a set of steps to follow to solve a problem. Abstraction, which is identifying the most important information in order to solve a problem. And pattern recognition, which is noticing trends and being able to make predictions. I was first introduced to computational thinking as a classroom teacher. I was a Project Lead the Way teacher and master teacher for some time. And I was really blown away with the power of student choice and student agency and learning how to solve complicated problems and doing those open-ended problem-solving activities that they do in computational thinking, and just how much this increased their confidence and their self-efficacy and their ability to perform well academically and outside of the school day as well. In my work with Project Tomorrow, it's been really exciting to see how teachers and students are approaching problems in such creative ways in Michigan, where my work is, as well as in New York City.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. And finally, we'll turn it over to Joe.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Melendez. I am currently the Script program lead at CS for All. Script is a framework / workshops / process that we take district teams through, where they can create a CS vision, do a self-assessment across our framework rubric, and then create very robust implementation plans for integrating CT and CS into their classrooms. I first got introduced to computational thinking many years ago when I was more involved with curriculum writing and development. I first started at the New York Academy of Sciences, just focusing on STEM programs. But as I progressed throughout my career, eventually I was working for the New York City Department of Education. I was the computer science education manager for the borough of Manhattan early on around 2016, where we were still trying to figure out how to get computer science into all those classrooms. And as we had the conversations with those district leaders and school leaders, you know, we were really looking at how can we make computer science more accessible for students, but also for the teachers and, you know, leadership and administration at the school level. So by looking at computational thinking, we saw it as a stepping stone to some degree to at least get that language going. And then, you know, once I left the Department of Education, I was working with Cornell Tech as a teacher in residence there. And this was right before the pandemic. And I had a couple of schools that I was coaching, focusing on integrating computational thinking into their classrooms. And I'll go into more detail later as far as the work that I did there. But, you know, eventually I started to develop more resources for CS coaches, those that are supporting at the district and even state level. So through this work at CS for All and part of the script work that we do, we really focus through some of our rubric areas around computational thinking, where it fits, how to plan it, and again, how to begin to integrate it in our school systems. As far as my definition for computational thinking, I think we already got a lot of good definitions, but I'll just say it's a way of looking at the big problems, breaking them down to smaller ones, getting rid of the information we don't need, see if there are any patterns, and then come up with a step-by-step solution to solve each of those little problems.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise with the audience. We're going to turn the corner now and look at some examples from the field. So I'd love to hear from the presenters some examples from the field of how students are empowered using computational thinking. So Joe, we'll stick with you.
All right. Yeah, so, you know, in regards to computational thinking, what resonates the most with me is always this ability to integrate more metacognition, right? So this is the idea that our students can begin to think about their thinking, right? And by using computational thinking as a way to solve problems, and you know, it's, in my opinion, a way to also reduce the anxiety that might be involved in the classroom for many of our students, right? When we present them with, you know, these rigorous activities or exercises, you know, we have some students that might excel in that environment, and there are other students that, again, it can be very scary to be presented with something that big. So by understanding a method where they can look at that larger problem, you know, decompose, break it down, look at it at, you know, smaller details and solving those pieces one at a time, you know, it's just a very good system for problem solving. Teachers are already doing this in the classroom, right? We see it in ELA, we see it in math. So really, you know, with the work that I was helping do at Cornell Tech, what we were trying to do is really integrate computational thinking language into the classroom first and foremost, right? Getting the teachers really comfortable using that language. And little by little, you know, as students become more familiar with that terminology and they enter the CS classroom, they are just much more comfortable with that process. And again, later on, I'll go into a little bit more detail with an example of how we would actually do that.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Katie, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So I brought a couple of examples today. This comes from a teacher in Linden, Michigan. Her name is Beth Molnar. She's been working to coach a number of teachers across all different subject areas on computational thinking integration. And this is one activity she shared with me. She had students in a science classroom take a look at an excerpt of text on density. And students they used that text to create blackout poetry, or she renamed it abstraction poetry. So the students went through the text and they selected words and phrases and compiled that into a poem. The trick here is that the poem had to convey the main ideas of the original text. So students needed to demonstrate their understanding of the subject matter, the subject area goal, in addition to making use of those computational thinking strategies. If we could go to the next slide, there's an example of a student's work. So you can see a poem that a couple of Beth's students were able to create. And I just really love this activity because it allowed students to both meet their content area goals, demonstrate that understanding, use computational thinking. I can see abstraction here, pulling out that necessary information. There's some decomposition, there's pattern recognition, and algorithm design as well. But it also results in this really creative work, which I think is sometimes a misconception that computational thinking doesn't result in creative work and it's too rigid. And this is just a beautiful way that could be used in any subject area. The next example I wanted to share on the next slide is from one of our schools in New York City. We've been doing work with some schools in New York City for about the last 5 years. And this school, PS 329, they every year do a social justice project. And this past year, they were focusing on food insecurity. And the students discovered that they were living in a food desert. So in order to address this issue, they did a few things. One, they decomposed some persuasive writing samples to create their own persuasive writing, to talk to people in power who could help. But they also took things into their own hands and used their computational thinking skills to create a farmer's market. So over the course of the year, they hosted a number of farmers markets at no cost to themselves. They got donations of fresh fruit and vegetables, which I think is just such a great example of the ways that students can take these computational thinking ideas and just run with them in such inspiring ways to solve problems for their community.
Excellent. Victor, some examples from you.
Absolutely. So I wanted to share a couple of our project-based learning. A lot of the work we do with Coding with Culture is computer science related. But we'd like for students to make sure that they understand that those concepts, we're not only asking them to learn them to be able to code. Of course, we look at the world that we're preparing students for, and we see that the 4 skills of computational thinking are used in so many different areas. And so we want to make sure that we have as many real world examples as possible for students. So if we can go to the next slide, one of our projects that we do is the Black Superhero Project. So as I came into teaching coding, I realized a lot of the, I was very excited about a lot of the, the fuss around the hour of code and getting kids coding. But what I wasn't seeing was how the application to the real world. So if kids were not interested in the actual physical act of coding, how do we continue to allow them to practice or to be exposed to these skills? So we looked at expanding those or using these different skills, so the decomposition, the abstraction in these real world projects. Because we have a big focus on cultural relevance, we talked about how students, the lack of representation of people of color in video games as protagonists. They actually went and researched some mythology traditions in different cultures and created superheroes, and then a video game, and coded and designed a video game from that. So the way that the computational thinking came into play for the decomposition piece, they of course had to break down the game design process. So asking students to storyboard, create storylines, characters, and the actual coding interaction. So by having students actually write that information down, it kind of forced them to think about their thinking. and see how they were using these skills with this real world process. For the abstraction, of course, one of the big things we had to tell them is, and where design thinking came into play was, who are we creating? What is the audience that we're creating this video game for? So the natural way that abstraction came in is they had to look, of course, at the characters' backstories, decide which details are essential for the game narrative and the goals they wanted to accomplish with their game design, and then simplifying some of those complex stories to fit the medium which way they were creating. Of course, the algorithm design is a little bit more of a natural connection. The students had to write the logic in step-by-step code. But what I did, because what I was realizing in computer science is that kids were very good at using the Blockly code. I had a lot of kids that were Scratch experts and could create these wonderful things. But the reason that where the algorithm design came into play and why it was important is that it allows students to think about why these blocks exist. Why is it important that we use this particular logic to make the game work the way that I want? And why it's important that these steps are also in sequence. So again, taking skills that students were already using, but again, having them kind of decompose them and look at how they're getting through these steps. And last but not least, in the pattern recognition, looking at recurring elements like different combat sequences in their games or dialogue patterns between characters and how they could make their code more efficient by using those patterns to write, then to go ahead and write their coding. So on the next slide, our second project, as we mentioned, we have a really big focus on college and career readiness, especially around historically Black colleges and minority serving institutions. And so one of our projects we do actually in conjunction with Project Lead the Way was designing an HBCU mobile app. And so we talk about using curriculum and again, the skills that students were, which is already a great and thorough curriculum for students to use. But we were able to put the culturally relevant piece there, but then also having students use those computational thinking skills. So for example, the decomposition, they had to divide the app into key features. So looking at other apps, campus tours, notable alumni profiles, scholarship information, HBCU quizzes, depending on what they wanted their goal to be, and then what audience they were creating their app for. The abstraction, of course, they had to look at the most important information as they researched the different HBCUs and minority serving institutions and deciding which parts were important to highlight. And then looking again at design thinking, the empathy piece. So if I'm creating an app for younger students, how do I simplify that or exclude the facts that may be confusing or include the facts that may be important if I'm creating an app, let's say for a student that is looking to learn more about these institutions. The patterns, of course, we look at successful education apps to identify and adapt common design elements like the interactive maps. Some students were able to find YouTube clips and thought that student perspective was important as they researched other apps and look for those patterns that made apps more susceptible to their audience's use. And then last but not least, we did a lot around algorithm design where students created workflows. Again, I'm huge on students thinking about their thinking. I think as someone mentioned earlier, a lot of teachers and students are already doing these things, but I think it's very, very important that we help name these and make these specific so students understand that the skills that they're already using are very, very valuable. So those are two of our projects and looking forward to sharing a little bit about how other teachers can do that in their classrooms.
Great projects. Thanks for sharing. And Sharin, we'll turn it over to you to take us on some examples.
Thank you. Yes, I'm really excited to share a recent collaboration between Digital Promise, Computer Science for All, Robin Hood, and the New York City Department of Education to integrate computational thinking with literacy skills. So we came up with these highly accessible computational thinking routines for K-5 English language arts. And you know, many times students don't have opportunities to learn computational thinking in the elementary grades. And by high school, disparities already exist. So we're excited to have developed highly accessible and inclusive routines for integrating computational thinking into any K-5 English language arts class. And what's more, the routines are based in well-established research on early literacy development. If you could go to the next slide. So first for the routines, we wanted to identify 4 computational thinking practices that we were going to teach throughout each of the routines. So we chose abstraction, algorithmic thinking, pattern recognition, and decomposition. Next slide. And so for each of these, we developed computational thinking routines with lesson plans, anchor charts, a wide variety of resources. And I just want to turn your attention to the BOAT for Building Ideas routine. For this routine, we integrated computational thinking into the writing process. So if we look at the description, students build ideas through concrete steps: brainstorm, organize, abstract, and transform. While organized, students should look for patterns and group ideas. While abstracting, students identify the most important concept from each grouping. So really integrating the concepts of pattern matching and abstraction into writing. And so this is kind of the work we did throughout each of the routines and each of the lessons. If you can go to the next slide. And we developed these anchor charts that I absolutely love that are highly visual and accessible for students. So for example, for the BOAT anchor chart, students brainstorm or write down all ideas that come to mind, organize, look for patterns and group ideas based on similarities, abstract, identify the most important concept from each grouping, and transform, connect concepts together with old and new relationships. And we've also developed really accessible lesson plans. I myself was an English as a second language teacher, and I know how important it is to have accessible lesson plans. So we don't only have highly accessible lesson plans for teachers, but we also have scripted lesson plans for teachers who are new to computational thinking.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing these great examples of how to empower students with computational thinking skills. Now it's time to share some strategies. I know you all have a lot of them. So who wants to go first?
I'll get us started, Jason.
Great.
A few general strategies before we get into some concrete things that teachers can do today or tomorrow even. Our research has found, and Victor and Joe both mentioned this before as well, vocabulary usage is hugely important in the classroom. Students need to be hearing teachers using these terms, really modeling the use of these terms and their sort of out loud thinking as they work through problem solving. And students need to be practicing to use these words, even down to our littlest learners. They can handle saying pattern recognition and algorithm design, believe it or not. I liken this to if I'm working on a project where I'm trying to build something or fix something, and I need to use tools in the garage, but I don't know what my tools do or how they function or what their names are, it becomes a lot harder of a job. So if our students know the names of these tools that they can reach for in their toolbox for problem solving, it's just so much more powerful for them. Another thing that has come out of our research and our work with teachers and schools is that computational thinking really needs to go hand in hand with the various content area goals. So computational thinking can be used to elevate and empower students throughout all of their academic subjects. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't translate to the other subjects when it's taught alone on an island. It really works well when it's integrated into those real world problems as well as the content area problems also. So a few concrete strategies that teachers can try even this week. One is giving students opportunities to reflect on how they're already using these computational thinking skills. So at the end of the day or the week, during morning meeting, bell ringers, or exit tickets, teachers can ask, which computational thinking skills did you use this week and how? Now students are using the terminology and they're making connections to ways in which they are computational thinkers already, and they feel empowered and capable, which is hugely important. We can also ask these reflective questions after a student finishes a particular task or problem-solving activity. How did you use computational thinking to solve that equation? How did you use, which computational thinking skill did you use to decode that word? And now students can start to look for those connections as well. Now, all of these may require some scaffolding depending on your students and their comfort level with computational thinking. So for our students who are newer to computational thinking, we might say something like, I noticed that you highlighted keywords and phrases in that passage in order to figure out the main ideas. Which of our CT concepts uses identifying the most important information? And then students can make that connection to abstraction. So we can scaffold and cue them up for making those vocabulary connections. We can also reframe tasks before we begin them to ask students which CT concept would help you accomplish this task, which CT concept will help you to record your observations on this science experiment, which CT concept will help you to understand how a bill becomes a law. And we can have students start to make those connections and name those tools even before they start to embark on a new task. And finally, we have found that a lot of times students start to engage with computational thinking in low pressure ways as a good way to get things started. So, and start those conversations around computational thinking. So games, puzzles, brain teasers, activities where students can be challenged and feel confident and competent in their own abilities, and then having conversations around how those problem-solving skills link back to computational thinking really helps lower the pressure for students and build their confidence so they can start to translate their mastery of these skills into all of their various academic areas, and obviously outside of the school day and outside of schooling as well.
Great examples. Thanks for sharing. I'll turn it over to Joe.
All right, I'm glad that I went next because, you know, Katie mentioned the puzzles, and during the pandemic, I was helping out with a couple of schools where I designed some computational thinking lessons based on these, I think they're called Hive puzzles. And part of the process was having students use their, you know, CT to understand how to first solve the puzzle before even going in to solve it itself. But, you know, what I really wanted to talk about is that beyond, or even before getting into the classroom and using all these strategies, I think a lot of us might struggle with how to get CS and CT into our schools to begin with. And not just because I currently run, you know, Script with CS for All, but even before I joined CS for All, Script was a tool that I used as a coach and as I supported my districts and schools. And, you know, Script, again, I mentioned that it's a workshop, it's a process, a rubric. It's a good way of looking at that big problem, which is how do we bring computer science and computational thinking to our students? Then through the process, right, we can sort of create a CS vision, understand what it is that we are trying to design, and then break it down, right, like into specific goals based on the different rubric areas and subcomponents that we look at, and then creating our step-by-step instructions, our algorithm, right, which is our implementation plan. How do we make this work, you know, happen? And as we're seeing today, you know, we have a lot of organizations that have beautiful content that we can integrate into that process. But if and when you might be struggling at the school level or even at the district level to figure out how to bring this into your classroom, and again, through a lens of a for all, right? So we will have to design with all of our students in mind, with all of our teachers and staff in mind. You know, feel free to reach out to us at csforall.org, or you can email me at joe.m@csforall.org, and I can give you more information around that. Now, as far as going back a few years to when I was doing this more in the classroom, my favorite tool to use are flowcharts. So through flowcharts, right, we get to define the problem, and we ask, right, is it a well-defined problem? If yes, then you proceed. If not, then you go back and you refine that problem. This process, by the way, I would do it with both teachers and students alike. For teachers, it was useful to actually go through this process when looking at their lesson plans or the exercises and activities they were designing for their classroom. So they can see whether or not they're missing a piece that could, you know, in fact, confuse students more than anything else. So once we have a well-defined problem, we decompose it, right? We break it down. Have all the components been identified? Yes, then proceed to pattern recognition. If not, then we reanalyze the problem. Once we go into pattern recognition, we look for trends, or repeated structures, right? Do the patterns help simplify the problem? Yes, then proceed. If not, then we adjust for decomposition. Abstraction, right? Focusing on the most important details, right? Can the problem be generalized or simplified? Yes, then proceed, right? Then if not, then we can decompose or go back into pattern recognition. And then of course, based on all this, we can start to create our algorithm. And finally, we have to test it. So we can see that this strategy that we can use, as students, as educators, but also as planners at, a district or school level, we can take, computational thinking, go through the process, look at that big problem, which is, again, how do we bring CT and CS into our classrooms, and then break it down, right? Abstract what is most important, align it to existing initiatives and other things that might be happening in the classroom or at the district level. And then, use that to build on that sort of implementation plan.
Wow, great, Joe. I love the way you described flowcharts for students and teachers to visualize the process. So let's turn it over to Victor real quick and get some examples.
All right, absolutely. So I would say for me, one of the biggest pieces of advice that helped me incorporate into my classroom was starting with real world problems. For my students, I wanted to make sure that they were focusing on the skills. So I always wanted to make sure that I was designing projects that solve challenges that the students care about, right? So creating apps is something that's very much a part of their existence, but also looking at some community issues or building virtual spaces that celebrate their culture. When I say culture, I want to make sure that to emphasize that every student has a culture. So I know a lot of times we hear about culturally relevant teaching and why it's important. It's not just students of color. So culture means, whether you're from the suburbs or the city, or whether you're, youth is a culture. So we want to make sure we say culturally relevant. That speaks to every student in your classroom. So making sure that we look at the vantage points and their stories, and relating those situations where they practice these skills to those cultures. We also want them, of course, to apply those skills into real life. I know we had a couple of things we talked about. I think as a computer science teacher, we're really not doing a great job only teaching CT in the computer science classroom. Because I think although coding is a wonderful way for students to practice it, it's just as important for the music teacher or the math teacher to be saying the same thing, so that kid that says, hey, I don't want to code, they realize that the importance of computational thinking is still not lost on them. I think for us, it's important that we make cultural relevance the core. Again, integrating cultural themes, and again, representing all students' cultures and the cultures they represent into project-based learning to deepen that engagement. So, for example, we talked about the HBCU apps, the patterns that the students had to use. They created those video games, but they saw their identities in STEM. So one of the ways the Black Superhero Project expanded in a more multicultural is we looked at, with a third grade class, the different, they did the world mythology. So looking at outside of just the norm of the Greek and the Roman mythology, how can we look at these world mythology traditions? Again, use decomposition, take these characters, take their stories, break them into smaller parts, pick out the parts, the abstraction, the parts of the character stories that would be important to include in their games, and then go ahead, of course, and then write the algorithm to make the game come to life. I think a big part, one of the things that is not necessarily a name step of computational thinking, is the iterative prototyping, making sure that students are allowed to use computational thinking skills, but also to fail while they use them. So we talk about cycles of feedback and refinement in project-based learning, or even just in regular computational thinking tasks. I think that is a really, really important part. We tell students that we're expecting them to practice these skills, that failing at first or failing repeatedly and continuously improving is a big part of that learning process. So I think that iteration is huge, and making sure that the projects or the activities that your students will use to practice computational thinking leaves them enough safe room to fail and to improve. I think that's important because that is what the real world looks like. So again, we talk about the world that we're preparing our students for. The reason why computational thinking is so important is because we're not asking students to perform menial tasks many times that, education of old, where we were preparing students for the industrial age, where you were kind of going in and your tasks were already laid out for you. Whether students go into computer science or not, we see that this is definitely the information age. So these ideas of making decisions and having to come up with a plan, these are things that we're seeing in all walks of life. So I think it's important that students see the fact that, hey, just because you decompose or you thought that you got out the most important facts, or even wrote the algorithm, that this may just be the tip of the iceberg before you really get to the good stuff, so to speak. I definitely think that when we talk about computational thinking, it's important that students collaborate as much as possible. You want to make sure one of the ways that we emphasize the vocabulary, as some of my esteemed colleagues said, and make it explicit for students so they understand exactly what they do, is give computational focused roles in team projects. So there's an algorithm designer, there's a data analyzer, there's a UI UX planner. So these mirror professional computational thinking processes, but allow students to understand and get that vocabulary is important, because in many cases they are experts in these areas, but don't realize it because we haven't been, or they just haven't been introduced to those terms as of yet. Last but not least, computational thinking definitely needs to be connected to broader skills. So again, it cannot just exist in the computer science classroom or the STEM lab. The reason that we love project-based learning is because it connects that computational thinking to communication and storytelling. So students explain how their algorithm works. So they think about how algorithm design works in their brain, but making sure that they're able to articulate the way that they use those skills as well. And so we also want to make sure that we're developing computational thinking as many of the wonderful speakers have said, is looking at these larger real world problems and having a tool belt, so to speak, to begin tackling some of those. So those are just a few of our tips or ways that I would give for a new teacher that is looking to implement in any classroom to get started.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing, Victor. So we'll go to Sharin to share out, and then we might have a question from the audience. So Sharin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to share these resources because we already have them fully developed on our website. So we will share the link to that in the chat. But we've developed anchor charts, lesson plans, look-fors, as well as a host of inclusive practices for engaging diverse learners. So for example, we have vocabulary anchor charts where we identify our key terms at different levels. Abstraction, find the most important parts. Algorithmic thinking, organize steps in the sequence. Decomposition, break something down into parts to better understand them. And pattern recognition, notice when something repeats. So really providing this vocabulary in a way that's accessible, visual, and easy for students to understand. Next slide. And so I'm really excited about these anchor charts that teach concepts because I feel like they're a really highly visual way to teach concepts. So this teaches decomposition, but as I mentioned earlier, we integrate our blended literacy toolkit with practices that are effective for early literacy research, in particular the science of reading. So we integrate decomposition with phonics. And so for example, if we're gonna decompose the word cat, we break it down into letters, sound out each letter, blend the parts together, and then say it all together. And then there's extension questions at the end where students can do this with sentences, paragraphs, and even stories. Next slide. And here's another wonderful anchor chart that's been created by my team to look at pattern matching. Ways in which you can find patterns in text, such as rhyming, look for words that end with the same sound. Relation, look for words that describe relationships between ideas. Repetition, look for repeated structures in text, such as sentences and paragraphs. And then there's extension activities, again, where students can circle, underline, highlight, use different colors to mark up the text and to see where they notice patterns. Next slide. And probably one of my favorite part about these computational thinking routines are look-fors. They're in the moment opportunities for teachers to see how computational thinking is already being taught in English language arts. So if we look at abstraction, filtering aspects of a problem or phenomenon for what is most important, we see abstraction occurs throughout the year in any English language arts class, such as identifying the theme or main idea of a story, classifying and sorting letters, letter sounds, rhyming words, and sentence strips, identifying key components of a writing prompt to respond appropriately, and collecting information from text and organizing the most significant points. Next slide. I really want to give a shout out to my team. I'm actually new to Digital Promise. This is my third month here at Digital Promise. So this was really developed by my team. Quinn Burke, Senior Director of Computational Thinking, 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐬 Lee, Senior Learning Experience Designer, and Alessandra Rangel, Senior Project Manager. So I just want to, of course, every effort is always collaborative, and wanted to give a shout out to my team. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing. So before we jump into guidance for newbies, there was a couple of questions that came into the chat. Wanted to take a pause here and see if any of our panelists wanted to answer. But Sharin, both you and Victor had touched on vocabulary. And the question that came in is, has anyone in this group supported standardizing vocabulary across content areas? So an example, what word or words in ELA, music, or science is the same or similar to an algorithm or debugging? The concepts are embedded, but are the vocabulary connections also emphasized? So I wonder if somebody on the panel wanted to tackle that question.
Yeah, I can tackle that, especially with respect to ELA, since we're sharing the English language arts routines. So if we look at the example of algorithm, it really has to do with sequencing steps in the correct order. And so the words sequencing in order appear all the time in English language arts classes. For example, in vocabulary with English language arts, you can sequence letters in a word, you can sequence words in a sentence or sentences in a paragraph. Order occurs, ordering the words in a sentence correctly, ordering the events in a story. Also, a lot of the key concepts in computational thinking have to do with English language arts. For example, if you look at debugging, that's really the same thing as revising a paragraph or revising a piece of writing. So a lot of these concepts are actually already being taught, which is what I really like to look for is that we present in our routines. And it's just a matter of finding what's already being done and kind of like enhancing that by bringing out the computational thinking skills.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing. We have another question in the chat. And this question is, curious if these strategies are effective with neurodiverse students. Victor, I wonder if you might tackle this question.
Absolutely. And I would say undoubtedly, yes. I worked with a school that had a neurodiverse population here in Atlanta. And what I found is that computer science and computational thinking was one of the areas where they tended to excel. I think making sure that allowing students to, have different entry points into computational thinking spoke well to students' different learning and even different communication styles. I'm also on a board because, again, equity is a big part of the work that we do. So I am on a board for a charter school here, also in Atlanta, that focuses on neurodivergent students. And our big thing is in incorporating these skills to allow these students to experience success in the classroom. And so what I find is that it definitely encourages the creativity, which can support that neurodivergent thinking by encouraging students to brainstorm a lot of different solutions, but also students that tend to fare better with structured thinking, the algorithmic thinking, which provides the predictability and the clarity for students who may perform more routine and order. So I think allowing students to look at, again, I think where the real world examples and the project-based learning is important for those students to thrive is that there's so many different areas on these project teams that these students may experience in their real world life, right? That will allow them to shine in one of these particular areas or another. So I think for me, I've been amazed at the work that computational thinking as a larger area, of course, computer science more specifically, but the ways that it allows our neurodivergent students to excel in our classes.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the responses, and also thank to all the panelists for sharing the strategies. I'm sure these are going to be helpful for schools starting up this fall. We're getting close to the end of our time for this webinar. So before we move to questions, I'd love to hear from each of the presenters about 2 pieces of guidance that you would give for those that are new to computational thinking. And Victor, we've got you on screen, so we'll just start with you.
So I think, as most of my wonderful colleagues have said, go ahead and just go ahead and take the leap. A lot of the great work you guys are doing as educators, even if you're new to education or just new to the concept of computational thinking, is that it really is no reason to reinvent the wheel, right? I think being intentional about the work that you're doing, looking at some of the practices or pedagogy that you use in your classroom, and just start naming some of those skills. I think it's more reflection versus creating, but also start with what's familiar. I think I want to make sure that we are being aware of the fact that educators are asked to do more and more each day. So leverage those everyday problem-solving activities to include computational thinking. I don't think you have to necessarily come out of what you're doing already or add 30 minutes to your day. And that can be as simple as breaking down a recipe, which is decomposition, or as I think it was, I forgot to mention the ELA strategy. So like, how do we recognize patterns in words? So again, by naming and being intentional about naming it, it doesn't really necessarily require you to change curriculum. But again, just allow students to see. And I think that's empowering for kids too, to realize, hey, these are already things that I know how to do. So now that I have this big fancy word I always tell my students, go get in the car and tell your parents that you did algorithmic thinking in first grade. And I guarantee you, whatever you ask for. So again, it doesn't necessarily take a brand new way of teaching. Just think about and reflect on what you guys are already doing. And last but not least, I would say integrate that computational thinking into those passion projects. So think about things that your students love, talk to your students, find out what things are important to them. And I would encourage those teachers that are new to it to incorporate it. So it's not like you're totally pulling in and having to get student buy-in and also teach or have them reflect on these different skills. So start from a point of excitement for the students or for your classroom, and then go ahead and practice those skills there.
Great advice. Thanks for sharing. Joe, thoughts on computational thinking for those new to it?
Yeah, I think Coach Hicks really gave a lot of good examples and strategies. And I just wanted to say that I agree, especially with using what's already in place, right? What I try to recommend for teachers is first become comfortable with the terminology. And I think all of our panelists will agree, if you've done enough work with CT, you can't help but think in CT moving forward. Everywhere you go, you start to, I need to decompose, I look for patterns, right? Abstraction, algorithms. It's everywhere. It's in everything that we do. So the more comfortable our teachers are with the terminology, again, the more natural and organic it leads into their already existing lesson plans and curriculum. And I wanted to also shout out to our friends at Digital Promise, who have a lot of excellent resources around CT. And I think someone had asked a question in the chat around, how do we inform teachers about CT or bring it in, when we're also trying to bring in things like data science, et cetera. Well, they have a great CT Pathways toolkit, which breaks that down, and you can better understand what computational thinking is. But, I'll just reiterate, first and foremost, as educators, really get comfortable with the terminology and start to practice within your own practice, how you design your lessons, your activities, how you explain things to your students. And sure enough, you'll start to build it into all of your lessons moving forward.
Great advice. Katie, same question. Any advice for those new to computational thinking?
Yeah, so all of this vocabulary can be a little bit overwhelming for teachers to feel like they need to go back to the studs and redesign lessons. And we really feel that computational thinking shouldn't be one more thing to teach. So to help make it more doable and approachable for students and teachers as well, we always recommend starting with just one strategy. So decomposition, algorithm design. A lot of folks like to start with pattern recognition because it's terminology that students are very familiar with already. But getting started with just one concept, see where it fits in nicely with your lessons that you already have planned, the projects that you're already doing, and really leaning into and emphasizing that one concept, sort of seeing the world through that concept with your students for a while until you and they are both comfortable, and then bringing in a second concept and focusing there, and eventually building up to all four. So just pacing yourself and starting with just the one concept to start. Another piece of advice, and this comes from some of our teachers who've been doing this work for a while, they had to become really comfortable with being uncomfortable, with not being the answer teacher and not being that guide for students, and being able to let students struggle a bit and find new creative solutions and new creative paths to those solutions. And it can be really uncomfortable for some folks, but it's really, really empowering for students.
Great advice. Thanks for sharing, Katie. Finally, Sharin, any parting advice for those new to computational thinking?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I really enjoyed the unplugged activities as a way of learning abstract concepts. I remember when my PhD advisor said, I was going to be studying computational thinking. And I was like, I want to get ahead on this. I'm going to start reading papers. And I see words like algorithmic thinking, abstraction, pattern matching, debugging. And my brain was starting to explode. And I'm like, what does all this mean? But I went to professional development, which used to be computer science in San Francisco, that just had incredible professional development facilitators. And we did a lot of unplugged activities to learn about these concepts. For example, loops is the way command repeats. So we would stand up and dance and look at the way each of the moves of the dance repeats, look at the way in which sequence of moves repeats, and really embody the concepts of loops. So these kinds of embodiment and visual activities that really help you wrap your mind around the concepts, for me, was really helpful to really learn what computational thinking was. And then the second piece of advice I would give is embrace mistakes. So mistakes are called bugs, and debugging is a huge part of coding. So if a student has a mistake, enlist another student in the class to help, or just stop and say, we have a bug in our code, and enlist the entire class to help. As a new teacher to coding, you don't have to have all the answers, and kind of working on it collectively is a great way to kind of reduce anxiety and just get in there and do it.
Excellent. Thank you all for those nuggets of wisdom. We are closing on time with a couple of minutes left. We have a few questions that we wanted to pose to the panel. One of them is, how should teachers and schools understand computational thinking alongside literacy in data science, artificial intelligence, and future emergent technologies? And then I think specifically to this, there's a lot of interest on how are you connecting specifically with AI, which is a hot topic right now, to computational thinking. So Katie, I think you can chime in on this.
Thanks, Jason. So we really see computational thinking as a literacy, as a skill that students learn and navigate and help them to solve problems. And I see a lot of relationship between computational thinking and data science as well, all about interpreting data, understanding the data, being able to make predictions and use that data to solve problems. I think there's a lot of correlation there. In terms of emerging technologies and AI, if we frame computational thinking as a framework for solving complex problems, the beautiful thing is it is not a framework for solving a specific type of problem or solving a specific box. We can't predict what the future holds. We can't predict necessarily what careers our kindergartners are going to have available to them when they get to that stage of their lives. And if they have the skills to solve open-ended problems that have lots of different strategies and lots of different solutions, they'll be able to navigate these new emerging technologies and have that success.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We are approaching time. There's one last question I think we can work in here from Doug. He's asking, how are you connecting AI, specifically prompting, to computational thinking?
I can answer that one if nobody else wants to take that one. I think for me, for the AI, especially with the prompting, the computational thinking helps students, and important to help for students to understand the why behind it. So even as you look at as I tell my students all the time, AI is it's not this magical thing that just pops out of thin air, right? You have to know what you're asking the AI to do. So I think for me, and it's interesting when I first, we do one of our mobile apps where syntax is not our big thing. And I tell students, well, hey, you can look into, using AI to help improve your app, but first you have to decompose the problem that you're asking the AI to help you with, right? Because if you tell the AI, well, hey, I just want to build, it's going to come up with a creation that may not be in line with what you want it to do. Also, the abstraction, I think, when you talk about the prompting, is knowing what you want the AI to consider when you want it to come up with your code or your, particular, whatever the output that you may want it to be. I think the pattern recognition is figuring out, one thing around creating images and artificial intelligence is that you start to find the patterns to get those things that you want. One of our students was using AI as a passion project to create a children's book. And so the pattern recognition came in as, what do I need? What parts of my prompts allowed us to get the images to appear like a storybook, so that you have the same characters, the same kind of thing. So I think for me, it's with the age of AI, so that students don't realize it's not a tool to cheat, so to just kind of say the thing, but that there's actually a process, and that again, it's making the work more efficient. It may make the work a little less time consuming, but there's still these skills of, again, breaking down, coming up with a plan, figuring out what works, what's important, what's not. And again, so I think it makes AI it helps students picture AI as a educational tool versus kind of just this, magical bag of tricks, so to speak.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing. So we are at time. I wanted to take a moment to thank our presenters so much for sharing your expertise and experience. And thank you all for joining us and sharing your questions as well. If you'd like to watch today's presentation again on an on-demand archive, it'll be available through edweek.org or using today's link within the next 24 hours. You can also visit edweek.org to find articles that explore today's topics. We'd like to thank EdWeek and PLTW for hosting this webinar. And if you'd like to find out more about PLTW, please visit our website at pltw.org. This concludes the presentation portion of our webinar. And we really want to thank all of you for joining us. So have a great day.